Hello, and welcome to the 14th installment of the Generalities series on this channel. And so, the premise for these videos, of course, if you are seeing one of these for the first time, is to take theory and apply it really to praxis in today's politics, and kind of wove that into a cultural analysis as well. Essentially, trying to demonstrate, philosophy and theory actually being used in the concrete world, sort of show the goods, if you will. And I think it's important and necessary to do this once in a while. Otherwise, you are a little bit too abstract, and there's something to be said about the abstract life really being an unhappy one, or an overly abstract life, that I think is worth considering sometimes when going down the sort of road of theory essentialism in a sort of way. But to start really right off in this musings capacity here, I wanted to perhaps look at some of Deleuze's philosophical analysis really of desire in the capitalistic post-World War II sense, and use that as a way to interject perhaps Michel Foucault, because that will be the next thinker I'm doing on the channel. And so I think perhaps the most appropriate term perhaps in capitalism really in 2023 is really the transformation to the service industry, which of course service has been around, or service is one of the axioms that help build the system in itself, and really the maturation of that in its lineage going back, of course, to a more primitive labor theory. But in contemporary times, services, especially in the online digital sphere, has really shifted away from just the material ways we used to think about these concepts. And I think a sort of analysis, as Foucault would do with violence and madness, these sort of concepts that you would just take for granted as just in a sort of lived horizon way, where you don't really think much about it, where there's a rich archaeology and genealogy actually involved, such as power and violence and so forth. But what does that really look like in a sort of post-Deleuzian, post-World War II sense? There's no actual solution, but a desire for the process in a sort of meta way that post-modernity really operated, where the description of these processes of reconfiguring the strata or deterritorializing it, and the old Deleuze, of course, used to talk about those the surface effects and sense capacity, and I think this applies really to the mode of capitalism in today's world, where there is these sort of problematized effects that are ongoing, and as much as we desire a solution and want to fix a sort of problem, of course, naturally, and to have a resolution, many of them, not just methods of thinking about the world, but in the practice of such as the medical industry, or how we consume content, where each of us are sort of these services on hand, if you will, to ultimately impose that you must return to my content to some capacity. I want you to keep watching my videos. I want this service to continue, this process of you and me evaluating on this video essay or musings video, if you will, together. And so this certainly ties in, I think, nicely to popular people who talk about ideas of the good life, of advice, of the manosphere, as we see, and so of course this leads to scrupulous behaviors, certainly with the grifting aspect, if you will, to try to sell you things, to get you into these services that actually don't give you ownership anymore. You don't own the CD to your music. You have the service of accessing this this space or this cloud where there is storage for you to just use on hand and rewind and fast forward, but it's based in the access to the service itself that really, I think, has put us into a new mode in hypermodernity. And such a mode, I think, lends itself to reconfiguring symptoms in a sort of recursive way. And I think this best applies to our discourses, which if you've ever had experience on any of these social media websites such as Twitter or Facebook, then you kind of see this recursive nature to discourse. So we kind of overlap on these same themes or subject matter over and over again. A lot of these generalities videos, I start to notice, although particular instances, particular events in that sort of political sense of relations with like these sort of exteriors in that Deleuzian sense, sort of become really recursive. And these events, while to some degree are judged as novelties, they still end up actually reproducing or repackaging these same sameness, and I guess would really be the best way of putting it. There's just this sort of abstract discourse that cyclically turns back into each other as sense particulars in the visual timeline, if you will, where videos now just sort of shoot themselves at you. There's no real interaction anymore where you even click on a video on the timeline. These shorts just come at you all the time. You're just being assaulted by these effects at all times. And so this really lends to no affirmation of a sort of solution, no way of getting out of the service, if you will. The service needs to self-sustain itself. The service needs to either be affirmed or rejected wholesale. And so this kind of goes into the line that I've been messing with lately with the service actually makes up the terms. When you sign to the terms of service, access to the services is actually what will nominate what the terms that we agree with, which none of us actually read the terms of service on any of these websites. It's so long and in that sort of legalistic, bureaucratic, long written form, meant to just only really bureaucrats within the system actually have enough knowledge to simplify and actually magnify and make intelligible such a doctrine. And so you're kind of just trapped into just agreeing with whatever they want to penalize you with. And this might tie in, of course, really with Foucault and his power analysis, and the shift, of course, where Deleuze says that he was a philosophy of desire, to now Foucault and his analysis of power. And so what would that actually look like, where desire and power are really put into this structure, but it's this post-structure world, if you will. And so you could perhaps see why, in that sense, the process, the cure, if you will, actually embeds itself within the problematization, and solutions are not actually meant to eradicate problems anymore, but to make them almost a sort of a way of just enduring these sort of symptoms. And this is definitely something to be said about perhaps psychology and pharmaceuticals today, where we can all agree that there's plenty of medicines that are meant to really treat symptoms, and Foucault does this with his genealogy of medicine, really, or the medical space, from the body to the soul, certainly with punishment as well, as we'll get into. But here I think it's perhaps interesting to look at how most of these services of medicine now are regenerated every month, and really are just meant to curtail the sort of symptoms that get in the way of you meshing into the capitalistic axiomatics going on around you. Can you hold your job down? Can you hold it together enough to be a family man or a good big brother, whatever the case may be. Those sort of codes, if you want. And this is not saying that that's not necessary for people. That's not really the point of the analysis here, which I think some people, Foucault is a lot of things, as we'll get into, and there's certainly a lot to be said there. But I think a lot of people miss on his analysis, really, that simply critiquing sort of a system or an institution doesn't mean that you want to just simply abolish it, although Foucault did certainly express anarchism in a lot of ways. I think the same could be said here, of course, with therapy and the therapeutic industry, with the use of services here, where there's no actual ambition towards a solution. It's just these sort of willingness to endure symptoms and making the subject and subjugating them actually funny enough to sort of dependency on this service in exchange for enduring symptoms of whatever the disease at hand could be. And of course, this is much different than how we would have saw the body or the disease and the material framework in different epistemes that Foucault talks about. This is sort of previewing, really, Foucault's philosophy also, that I wanted to sort of bridge into this video as we've left Deleuze now and continue our postmodern adventure here. In addition, though, I think perhaps you could use this to say, and certainly I've noticed this recently as it's been brought to my attention again, of a post-Deleuzian world where there's a sort of value to having these synthetic events where we could push the necessary need for these social energies, these intensities between malfunctioning assemblages, if you will, or the sort of space, the semiotics that's vacant, and the ambition to re-territorialize this. What if this is done through a sort of synthetic apparatus? Certainly, one could argue in the American zeitgeist, if you will, how if we could just harness these events in an ideological way, then we can actually move history, move narratives, quite literally move the state, because of course the state is always going to re-territorialize, recode, put these sort of refrains, if you will, back into the social coding. Otherwise, it'll just be pure chaos. And so, it's interesting to see this sort of supplement, which, there's an American fascination, as Derrida would say, with the supplement as compared to continental Europe. There's an interesting discussion on food that I saw on my timeline about American food compared to European food. And of course, I have no experience with European food, rather uncultured. And but you could definitely see that a lot of American cuisine is a sort of supplement of other ingredients, and I think in a lot of ways the economy and our agricultural systems really depend on much of the American populace eating these highly processed foods that are easily created really with just cheap sugars and stuff of that nature, instead of a more well-balanced diet, if you will, that actually requires, I think, far more of a materialistic framework and harnessing in the milieus of the world, if you will, than we see with the sort of supplement. The protein bar is a sort of supplement for red meat, if you will. You're trying to supplement with vitamin makeup, whether it's for time preference or quite frankly just a lack of material space to even hold the amount of food that's necessary for a well-balanced diet. Keep in mind that a lot of American society now is this these big apartment complexes where you just have this room, quite literally, if you went back 50 or 100 years, a one-bedroom room, if you will, and this is your entire living quarters. Food storage and stuff of that nature that isn't just highly processed and able to be just on hand year-round. Expiration dates, for example, they span years now in some instances, and there's a reason why that is. It's because they're in an entire different mode, a sort of tooling of food and keeping it on hand to just be inhibited at any time, regardless of climate even. And that's kind of interesting to perhaps see how food, even as it's distributed globally, required it to be reductioned out of its localized capacity, and even in this in and of itself is a sort of transgression that I think a lot of people who examine techniques could perhaps use some brushing up on, because I think a lot of times such discussions, we usually talk about art, the military or the war machine, if you will, as compared to some of these systems, again, in that sort of Foucault way of looking at the power relations that could come out from this globalized, highly processed food system that is really stretching the nutritional value. There's a lot of evidence that no one really denies anymore about how much nutrients or lack thereof or sort of descent from the same products, if you will, maybe a generation ago. But now moving really to actual tangible politics, namely with Trump and his re-election bid. Of course, the main story as this video is being shot is his recent mugshot in Fulton County, and he's you do have to admire how Trump manages to be such a showman, and of course that's just a sort of given now in 2023. Most people won't deny that don't just absolutely just hate his guts and see no redeeming qualities in him at all. A very lowbrow way of examining a figure such as Trump. But there is a sort of reverence, if you will, to how Trump manages to really be patient and pick his spots at really profound times of really just picking the best possible scenario to be able to employ his branding, really his mimetic way of reaching out in mass democracy against a mass democracy that does not have any interest in covering him in any sort of good way, certainly. And so he's able to curtail that by using these opportune moments where he knows the spotlight is on him the brightest, and he's able to transmit these messages that sometimes eludes him in a lot of ways with his public speaking, but he's able to do something like this sort of revenge face, this vengeful look in this mugshot that I've never seen Trump look like this before, and it just goes to show his showmanship here, and his return to Twitter. Again, I think this just shows his opportune moment of branding. For many of these Generalities videos, I've been speculating, when is Trump coming back? He needs to come back. There's 50 million plus people attached to his account on Twitter, and the messaging out of that is of importance. But he waited it out. The election is literally about a year off now, and he rightfully, I think, continues to carry himself as an incumbent. He has not backed down on any of the allegations. And of course, as he's going on trial for such matters, he truly can't, even if he wanted to. But of course, I don't think that he's being pragmatic about this at all. And certainly in past videos, I've demonstrated and shown my opinion on that. No matter, but again, I do think that was one of Trump's finer moments that I've seen, where the mugshot, the return to Twitter, Trump manages to transcend again this binary we find ourselves in, these digital spheres that are very much coded with left and right ideological conviction in our social coding. And Trump manages to find ways to not only get both of these spheres to fixate on him at the same time, but actually he himself becomes this sort of subject that manages to somewhat escape this discourse, despite being the most polarizing out of them all. And a sort of paradox, he still manages to get invoked in the internet culture that's perhaps a little less in the politics of everyday life, and he still manages to reassert himself. And his catchphrases, of course, is a master linguist, in my opinion. He manages to transcend that, of course, with things like Bigly and Make America Great Again. How memed was that in the last 5 years? There's nobody else really that's able to coordinate and control discourse in a singularity, really, other than Trump. And we're seeing, discussions again as, is Trump really the hyper modern, big man really? And I think this is true, at least in our contemporary time. There's no one really that has the sort of wind to his back in the change of history in his single presence than Donald Trump, I think, currently. He's dominating another Generalities video again, and one of the ways he's actually doing that, funny enough, is his vacancy. And this was demonstrated. And of course, by the way, the trial, in case you want to buff up the Banana Republic argument, it's the day before Super Tuesday, as it's been revealed since I recorded this. So this is democracy at work here. But now I wanted to focus on how Trump made himself absent from the latest GOP debate, and he did an appearance with Tucker, and I didn't really pay too much attention to the actual appearance. I was more fixated on how the rest of this field looks without Trump's presence. And so DeSantis looked rather weak, which he's had a rough one, which I predicted. I thought he should have sat out. I did not see how he was going to penetrate the Trump base. Nobody was going to do that because, again, Trump should be treated as an incumbent, and he has the historical precedence, and still I think the math, if you will, in the American analysis of these political delegates, if you will, he still has the math on his side, very much in my opinion. And so nobody was really going to catch him, left or right for that matter. And so, DeSantis, in comparison, he's, managed to blunder himself because he tried too much to differentiate himself in, and this is true for everyone in the GOP other than Vivek. And he's the one who's actually built momentum and sort of taken away from Trump, which has caused an interesting insight into recent discussions about him and who actually donates to him. But you can tell that he's far more loose than the rest of the field, as he's able to really mimic Trump's positions. And because he's able to do that, as compared to the Chris Christies, the Ron DeSantis's, whether it's donor pragmatism or their actual political foresight to try to build this sort of coalition that's outside of Donald Trump, whether or not that's actually feasible. It's one of the strategies to try to immerse yourself in this primary season. And this was a tall task, and DeSantis ultimately fell on his face. I do wonder, though, about the GOP's future, as we sort of saw this demonstrated with his absence, and it doesn't look very good. It's not very promising at all. But I do think one of the things recently that has been interesting, and one of the things that Trump has managed to do quite literally, otherwise he wouldn't have such a mandate in the GOP, is his 2016 positions are absolutely accepted really on anyone outside of the party, if you will. And so seeing his 2016 stances on immigration and sort of leading towards a more identitarian way of thinking about American politics right now. This is deeply entrenched now, I would say, in the party, and this was demonstrated really with Charlie Kirk. Whether or not you find this change of heart, if you will, whether authentic or not, I think misses the point to some degree. To his credit, Charlie Kirk is now invoking past memes really of it's okay to be white, and it's interesting to see that shift really from that still sort of dissuasive paradigm going just a few years ago back to the Trump administration, where the like of Fuentes and Kirk has this this discrepancy here when it came to race. Clearly, though, within that base, this has made Charlie, whether or not it's authentic or not, ultimately, see the change in the sales and realize that he needs to actually reevaluate how identity is being looked at or accepted and talked about. Of course, this goes into really one of the observations that you see a lot of times in jest, but it's worth bringing up, especially with the discussion around Vivek, and you have this outsider really who ultimately is choosing to affirm an identity politics, or at least the will for an identity politics outside of himself. And I think that there is something to be said about this in a not so just coyish way. And of course, this is coming from someone who's not the whitest man on the world. And so there's a lot of interest around how the Anglo sphere in general, which of course is heralded for the likes of meritocracy, and of course this has a genealogy rich with the Christian tradition, I would say, with blood and one's circumstance, and how yes, this may comprise one's identity, but of course just the body itself, one's historical inference itself doesn't capture and is reductionary to the soul, if you will, and of course you can take that as a metaphor or take that further. And I think this was really one of the great pass downs, and ultimately one of that undermined it. We see the left all the time invoke that America is a nation of ideas, not of people. But of course, if you look into the Anglo tradition and the absolving of one's circumstance is actually a will within that own heterogeneous set, if you will. And so there is a sort of paradox, this sort of absurdism that we joke about a lot, but this is actually still, I don't think that there is it's nearly as contradictory as people would imply. And one of the things I found interesting in articles recently that perhaps could be a way of looking or thinking about this is racial differences in X-rays are actually seen within just these snapshots of the organs as AI has progressed now to analysis of such organs. And the AI is essentially able to discern just simply through these X-rays racial differences and able to formulate and posit what the racial identity is of the subject that is under the X-ray. And this perhaps is a way of looking at how race and certainly the discussions in the postmodern sense that we've been getting into recently on the channel, or an ethnic genealogy, a sort of milieu relationship with the earth, if you will. This was much more than just skin deep. It wasn't just pigmentation, but a sort of organs with race, and the abstract machinic assemblages weren't just simply pigment relationships with someone's distance to the sun, or how close they were to the equator. No, there is even more difference within the cognition, as you've seen. And skin was just rather rudimentary in the differences between people. And so I think that there is something more to be said here than just a society of ideas. Well, within the Anglo society, the sort of ideas, the sort of values ultimately were undermined by the very becomings other. That sort of ambition within their own tradition is actually its own undermining, and I think you're seeing the effects of that in the world today. But moving along, then, considering now the South Africa situation, where you have political parties again rising up, looking to quite literally remove white Aboriginals from South Africa. And it's interesting to see this just get not only just brushed to the side, but as the clips are running, there's people quite literally in the replies just saying that, oh, this just is not real at all. And it's very interesting to see the brevity one will actually take when they're seeing something that doesn't really align with them, and shatters how they could perceive the world turning out to be beyond them, if you will. And seeing that things might not turn out the same way, and there's a sort of will to just almost a will to nothing, and a sort of I won't even entertain such an idea, which is very powerful. And I think many of us on the right actually could learn from this in a sort of way, not of ignorance, but we should be more selective about discourses. And I think that will tie into the certain resurgence of certain measures. Again, this is going to go on YouTube, so toe the line, if you will. And obviously it's been almost 4 years now, and so I really believe that the best way of going about this is almost to do it as I am here. And yeah, maybe once in a while you have to mention it, simply to again rehash that you're not playing along, and you should starve the algorithm. You should a lot of these bot farms, they simply, again, in that sort of synthetic event way, they synthetically will arbitrate these narratives and discourses about certain things in a society or problems, and they'll astroturf them to the top, and you'll see it on your algorithm, or your trends. And many times this just turns out to be bot farms that are really trying to shape our discourse as it's happening. And one of the ways I think, although this can lend you to this sort of fate of Socrates, if you will, where you can't be totally indifferent to the outside world to the point where you have to drink the poison, but you also don't want to be so reactionary to you get a reaction out of everything. And so you have to pick your spots better, just as I think Trump did earlier in his examples. But before I wrap up this video, I did want to look at some of the cultural production that's going on, or how, again, going to that sort of left and right wing coding of the world, and this digitized twin cities, if you will, where you have these almost different word games going on in the construction of these digital city around you, and you have two vastly interpretations of these events. And one of the interesting things I think that's come out of this, though, is the consumption of each other's art, which in the 21st century, it's just so in your face about these agendas. The agenda itself is favorited, or the process of this agenda over the actual product and its art form itself. And still, though, you still have the rise of this sort of Deleuzian tracing, if you will, to hermeneutic interpretation of films like Barbie. But one of the things I found interesting, though, not just with Barbie and saying you can't come out with this sort of masculine interpretation, or having unexpected interpretations that the author didn't intend necessarily, but overall, this is a theme really of young boys playing with ideas and trying to bound themselves in the philosophical world, or enriching it, and this cultural disdain for it, where you see this these cringe memes, or they're trying to frame the young man as being this cringe outcast or incel, if you will, trying to learn Nietzsche, or reading Plato, and learning about one's history quite literally. And there's an absolute disdain for this that you can see in many of these, not just posters online who cares what a bunch of trolls have to think, right? But some of these accounts are actually verified, academic, like some of them with the institution handle that they're about, replying to hermeneutic interpretation of people on the sphere. And there's something very disturbing about that, simply because a young boy starts an intellectual journey, and maybe he doesn't have all the answers, that you should demoralize him and cut him down, as they play with higher ideals, I would say, in the world, trying to escape the becomings animal that we find ourselves in increasingly, where the postmodern romanticized such intellectual, or the recoding or reconfiguration of intensities to come in unique ways that wasn't just inhibited in your bodily experience. One could argue, of course, that this is, of course, reductionary, and you're losing the ideal, the ascension, if you will, that I think is something to consider when looking at a lot of these postmodern thinkers that we do on this channel. But lastly, it is interesting to see how country music has found itself now subjugated really to this coding, which country music was rather homogenous, or at least it was a sphere of no real interest. And it's kind of interesting to see how a lot of people who don't really care about country music, quite frankly, they're chiming in on these recent songs, and there's this cultural analysis really again where the author's intention is and harnessing it and using it towards ideological convictions and how you interpret worldly events going on around you, and sort of play back into it. Again, that's really the art form, or the lack of, really, in the privileging process here in the 21st century. And so one of the things that I think is interesting that many talk about is the yearning for authenticity, and a lot of the critiques to certainly the small town song is there's authentic and real country music out there, and there's this real working class that or at least there's going to be this real consciousness that the working class or these people are going to eventually converge around if they just weren't psyoped. This is an interesting boomer really relic, if you will, of the authentic self is it's always out of our grasp. It's actually in this process of services in some capacity, I would say, and plays into the economy. But this search for authenticity, and you see this in sloganeering, and even what I've critiqued about the sort of bourgeois liberal authentic cuisine in America, where of course this is just the rehashing supplements, if you will, of these foods, but somehow they found this authentic one, this one that's just a little bit better, and it's more authentic and it's more real. But I think again, this, in a way, if we were going to take our contemporary times to its logical end, where a lot of these same people don't believe in historicism, or they fragment it and don't look into the rich traditions, or even wish to affirm them. A lot of them are antagonistic to them, and so this yearning for authenticity is actually one of disassociation, I think, in the 21st century. For it seems like we are more in that Baudrillardian sense, in these different assemblages or simulations, if you will, and so there might not actually be an authentic self, but it's actually the use of the larval self, if you will, and it's multifaceted, and how the dimensions in the molecular metaphor for Deleuze, there's degrees within it, of course, where it elongates, and there's these intensities and fields where these relations ultimately comprise the material world and codes it. The self doesn't necessarily just cohesively all appear in this one abstract particular moment in time, but it's far more dynamic, and it's actually closer to the authentic real, is actually synthesizing all of this. Actually, I think is more of the real than given credit for, and certainly there's a lot of interpretations that would say that this is faulty, but I actually think it's a different way of thinking about what is authenticity, and re-examining it, and what that actually truly means, and if it's just a sort of cliche in that Heideggerian sense, where you just have this norm that no longer has any energy, and it's just reasserted, sort of like how governmentality and law, it isn't the same as the sort of magical authority in its creation, or the war machine, and how it creates all of these different and new ways of structuring. And discussing authenticity is, a lot of naysayers to these works here are really saying that the desire or the problematization even within the song's content, and these historical wrongs or contemporary wrongs, or ills, if you will. This isn't the authentic, real one. My Marxist classical distinction is better, and there is an interesting way of seeing. A lot of these discussions actually go back to American culture, in a sort of way that Needle Drop, or Anthony Fantano as he's known. He got ribbed a lot for his interpretation of the North and the South, and this discussion of Richmond being close to Washington D.C., representing the elites, and he picks up this Civil War interpretation out of that, and but maybe this is of course silly, and he was ribbed for that, but what if it was actually reasserted in the 21st century, and so there might not be a geological distinction between the North and the South, but there is a distinction between the chuds and the authentic and real people of America. And it's interesting to see how songs like "Try That in a Small Town" that which are ultimately being censored, and what does that really mean is that these problems aren't actually the real problems. There's a call to that this isn't the authentic version of this, and it's very funny to see not just the hypocrisy, of course, but the necessity for this belief that that there's this authentic real that is, and you could say that perhaps in some cases a lot of people on the right feel this way about Black America, where Martin Luther King and the sort of colorblindness to conservatives of yesteryear, that is the real and authentic vision that Black America has, and these Democrats and the welfare system, it's getting in the way from that. Again, I'm just critiquing how I think that trying to give yourself to this process towards authenticity is actually a faux pas, and the authenticity is actually you could say that perhaps it wouldn't be so hidden if it actually was authentic. But I do want to perhaps point out a sort of hypocrisy, of course, with the country music channel taking umbrage to the calls of violence and the censorship of the song for "Try That in a Small Town." But XX Tentacon, of course, with some of his imagery in music videos. There's that infamous music video where he's tying the noose around the young white blonde-haired, blue-eyed kid, and you'll never see any sort of cancellation for something like that. And again, this is just to end here with the pointing out that there is a historical precedent really for where we find ourselves in right now with again, a lot of whites are in this division of none of these racial problems are actually the authentic ones, or the problematization isn't authentic. It's manufactured. Um, Another way of looking at this is, again, how mainly I'm focusing on the left, of course, but a lot of people on the right, they say racial division is just to get us away from talking about Epstein, or talking about the sheep sacrificing elites, if you will. But there is a sort of denialism here that I think should be discussed more, in the double standard, really, of the arts of violent images towards whites, as compared to whites saying that they would maybe defend themselves in their communities, which, again, it's a very defensive song, which, again, kind of actually goes into, in a I would say, actually, in an endearing way, into the Anglo tradition, which of course could be traced back to even something like Plato's Republic, which applies to Western civilization, and its influence of largely one of the greatest aspects of justice is minding your own, and not interfering in the practical matters of other people. And so it's funny to see how explicitly in the song it's very defensive in that sort of Christian tradition of if you don't get in my way, then we can live at peace, but if you do, then it's an eye for an eye. But the last thing I guess I want to brush up on before I end here is recently Putin had his own insurrection, as it was reported, and it was interesting to see as the analysis was really flying in real time, again, how the electric digital world and decentralized world we find ourselves in, where there's all of these different competing institutions and authorities serving information at light speed, where you're supposed to rationalize these events as they're actually happening, but this is a vast process, or at least it used to be. If we were going to use, again, postmodern thinking here, the rupturing and of events, and ultimately the creation of new patterns, of new sciences, if you will, or new rules, or convictions. You can't really do that with an event that's ongoing as it's ongoing, but yet we are actually we're no longer abridged, if you will, or there's a vacancy with space and time and the distance of that information reaching you. You in many regards are actually ahead of the cause, and so you're just having these effects hit you in all of these different ways, and you're expected to come up with a sort of rationalization, or at least a framework to make judgments really about this, or propositions, if you will. And so again, the analysis was flying fast and fervently, and of course there's this service of on-demand analysis as it's happening. Whether or not it's actually the truth is actually in a lot of ways consequential. You can of course bring up how your take from 6 months ago ended up being the right one, but or your observation, but did that really matter compared to a structure of services that being the first one there, and not necessarily hitting the nail on the head, but perhaps being more in a directional correctness, if you will, than a more concrete factual one. And so if your direction of interpretation was more correct at the time of when that service or when that demand was on hand. But there is something to say though about again, this idea of synthetic events that I've brought in this video here, where it's like the old story of the boy who cried wolf. If we're always looking for events to harness new ways of politics or new ways of thinking, eventually it's going to require such an event and that sort of metabolism, if you will, if we're kind of becoming these sort of junkies, these intellectual junkies, if you will. And I think that lends itself to really fly-by-night analysis and something as important as a coup. And of course, in the end, it seems that Putin assassinated the main Wagner leader in a plane crash. And I think there's a distinction here to be made of that Eastern demonstrations of power, where the system can be very physically and symbolically way more in the tradition of aligning itself together. Everyone was to know that he crossed Putin and he had to die for it, to cement one's power. But it's also about managing to keep the sort of mystery of who actually did it, for obvious reasons, of course. But again, you could see that sort of distinction in a Foucault way, if you will, of the disciplinary post-World War II society compared to one that has more into the lineage of still using violence on a more ontological level, I would actually argue. And so these demonstrations of violence in such regimes or places in the world are still rather foreign to the West, despite the fact that, of course, they happen in that Agamben sense where and you can kind of see this hint with Foucault, of course, in his analysis too, in the disciplinary society, where there still can occasionally be violent preclusions onto the lived body in that old-fashioned tradition, but it's done away from the public sphere, whereas in the Eastern world it's far more symbolic, and it needed to be seen by not just enemies, but even allies in the outside world. But yeah, I think this is going to do it for my musings video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Again, we're going to be starting Foucault soon on the channel, so I look forward to you guys watching and dissecting that thinker with me. And it'll be interesting to see how this next election cycle goes. And I hope you guys join me for that ride. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you for Foucault's analysis.